The electoral amendment bill has been in the spotlight this week. The bill was officially passed by Parliament. This means that independent candidates will be allowed to contest elections. But various civil society organizations have scrutinized the bill, saying it will have an impact on the country's democracy. Let's now speak to Ebrahim Fakir, who is the Director of Programs at Auwal Socio-Economic Research Institute. Ebrahim, thank you for making time. Were you surprised that members of Parliament voted for this bill regardless of the concerns raised about it in its current form? I mean, it's been clear that some clearly don't want constituency accountability.
Hi, Clement, and I'm not surprised at all. I mean, the reality is that any move away from a pure proportional representation represents an existential crisis, a very real existential crisis for most of the political parties, in fact, from the third largest party down. If you look at the spread of electoral results, Clement, you'll find that the bottom 15% of electoral support is shared amongst 9 parties. Now imagine you had a constituency-based system or you move anywhere away from proportional representation. Almost all of those are completely wiped out. If, on the other hand, you introduce and you maintain this pure proportional representation, but you introduce a threshold of support to qualify for a seat, let's say, for example, even something as low as 1.5% or even 2%, you will find that at least 8 of these parties would be completely wiped out. So I'm not surprised that they didn't vote or that they did vote for this bill, firstly. Secondly, I think we've known for a long time. Our parties have the hollow sham of claiming power to the people. In fact, all they want is power to the parties. And this bill and the passage of this bill demonstrates that. The idea of social distance in a country like ours was a reality long before COVID. And our political parties and public representatives are an perfect example of the social distance.
So this was an opportunity for members of Parliament to really come up with a bill that is people-centric, right, that empowers people. And you, as you have argued now, that this bill actually empowers them and not the people. And the question I have is, what should the people then do who are being represented by these political parties in Parliament?
Good question. I think we're going to do what we've always been doing. Some of us complain, some of us moan, some of us write and speak when we can, and others who don't, guess what they do, Clement? They take to the streets. Sometimes they burn community infrastructure. Sometimes they do other things, even more dastardly than what I've just described. So that in reality is what we do to get the attention of our politicians. Now, make no mistake, I have absolute sympathy for the fact that political parties play an important role. They play an aggregating role, they play an outreach role, they play a role in which they come up with ideas, they make policy proposals, and so on. Fair enough. They must be accommodated in the system. But where the system is exclusively focused to be party-centric, it means that the parties themselves don't care about their voters. Then you have the absolute canard and the absolute arrogance of MPs claiming that people who moan from society, or as they call it, civil society, are actually shills for other interests. The reality in this case is that they are shills for the interest of their funders and their donors, and we actually have the interest of ordinary citizens and giving the most amount of power, the most amount of leverage, the most amount of influence to ordinary people, to ordinary voters. Now, I must say one last thing, Clement. You rightly touched on the point that this was an opportunity. These opportunities come around once in a generation. They don't come around too often. You don't play around and tinker with the governance system frequently or often because, it's obvious to all of us that if you tinker with that too often, you create instability in the system, discontinuity. What we want is stability and continuity. Here was an opportunity which is presented to you. You decide to squander it. Now, I'm afraid to say that the parliamentarians are reading the judgment from the Constitutional Court in absolutely crude and narrow terms. Because, fair enough, the judgment does say the system must be devised by Parliament, must accommodate independent candidates. No more, no less. They will say, we have complied with this judgment. But they don't look at the absurdities that they have introduced into the system. One of those absurdities, sure, independents will compete, but they compete on an unfair footing with political parties, number one. Number two, parties or individuals as independents who will receive a threshold of votes above what they require for a seat is actually going to waste all those votes. Worse still, some of those, in effect, will be redistributed to the next person on that list. Next person on that list may be a party. So a party is actually receiving votes which they were not entitled to. Can you see the absurdities which are built into the system, even though the malicious compliance and the crude interpretation of the Concord judgment is complied with, but the absurdities are not being thought about?
So what does this bill then say about accountability? Does it enhance it, or are these political parties going to continue evading public accountability?
Absolutely not. Accountability is the last feature on their mind. They don't want to think about accountability, Clement. They don't even want to think about oversight. Because the flip side for us, if we want democratic governance, accountability is one thing. Yes, you must get accountability from those people who are in executive office. When you are in the representative institutions of parliament, of a local council, or a provincial legislature, you must exercise oversight over those in the executive. You must demand accountability from them. Then, as our representatives of the public, you must be responsive to us. So these guys, more importantly and more fundamentally to your point, are not just evading accountability, they are evading and blunting oversight, and they are getting rid of the question of responsiveness. So ultimately, who are they representing? Their jackets, their donors, and their parties exclusively.
Yeah, and even though the Constitutional Court has even clarified that, in fact, their responsibility is to the electorate. So government, Ebrahim argues through the Home Affairs Minister that the bill was actually not aimed at changing the entire electoral system, but I'm wondering what really stopped these members of parliament from pushing the boundaries to ensure this constituency accountability, because evidence shows that parliament has failed on numerous occasions to do what it's intended to do, to hold the executive accountable. Even the Concord said that we need to strengthen parliamentary oversight and accountability mechanisms, and it's pretty clear that a move to that constituency-based system of proportional representation would have several advantages. So how would this help MPs exercise that effective oversight without worrying about their parties? So you are accountable to constituents and not necessarily your party.
It won't. And that's the short answer. It won't. It does not incentivize them to do that. In fact, it incentivizes them to do the complete opposite. So that's the short answer to your first question. The short answer to your second question is what stopped them from going through some kind of thorough reform process. The short answer to that is merely their self-interest. That's the only reasoning we can come up with, right? So to the extent that the Home Affairs Minister, Dr. Motsoaledi, is correct, they've complied maliciously, in my view, with the very narrow, crude interpretation of the court judgment. They squandered the opportunity. Hopefully, if they really believe that this is something that they want to stand on, they can build into this system or this new thing a sunset clause that would say that this is merely a transitionary mechanism, and beyond the 2024 election, we will look at thoroughgoing electoral reform. Because he's boldly saying, listen, this was just to comply with the Constitutional Court judgment. Crudely, but yes, compliance. It had nothing to do with electoral reform. If they genuinely believe in electoral reform, and they genuinely believe, more importantly, that citizens should have more power and more influence in the system, then they will build in the sunset clause to say it will be a transitionary mechanism, and post this 2024 election, we'll have some kind of thoroughgoing reform.
Yeah, and it's pretty clear that given all these concerns, this is going to attract litigation. And the question is, what's going to be the impact of that litigation on the deadline of December, but also the 2024 elections? Ebrahim Fakir, thank you.